Every mother knows the pain of swallowing her pride to protect her children's future. For 20 years, that's exactly what Lila did, working as a maid for the wealthy Prescott family, enduring daily humiliation because the job paid for her son's college education. She cleaned their marble floors, polished their silver, and bit her tongue when Eleanor Prescott treated her like she was invisible. But there comes a moment in every person's life when dignity matters more than money. That moment came when Eleanor embarrassed Lila in front of dinner guests over something as small as a water glass. "I can't live like this," Lila whispered, her voice shaking. What she didn't know was that Richard Prescott had been watching from the doorway, finally seeing his wife's cruelty with clear eyes. But what would make this millionaire businessman tell his maid to pack her things that very night? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 20 years ago, Lila Washington had walked up the curved driveway of the Prescott mansion with hope in her heart and her mother's worn leather Bible tucked safely in her purse. The sprawling Georgian estate sat like a crown jewel in the heart of Charleston's most exclusive neighborhood, its white columns gleaming in the morning sun. At 32, recently widowed and desperate for steady work, Lila had seen the housekeeping position as an answer to her prayers. "You'll do just fine here," Richard Prescott had said that first day, his handshake firm and his smile genuine. He was a man in his early 40s then, still carrying himself with the straight-backed posture of his military days, his grey eyes kind but focused. "Mrs. Prescott can be particular about how things are done, but I'm sure you'll catch on quickly." Eleanor Prescott had been different then too, or perhaps Lila had simply been too grateful to notice the warning signs. In those early years, Eleanor's criticisms had seemed like helpful guidance from a woman who took pride in her home. "The silver needs more attention, Lila," she would say, running a manicured finger along a serving tray. "Guests notice these details." Back then, Eleanor had at least looked at Lila when she spoke, had used her name instead of simply snapping her fingers for attention. The mansion itself had been a wonder to young Lila. 12,000 square feet of marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and oil paintings worth more than most people's houses. She had taken pride in maintaining its beauty, in the way the afternoon light caught the perfectly polished mahogany banister, in the fresh flowers. She arranged each morning in the grand foyer. Every room told a story of wealth accumulated over generations, but Lila had learned to appreciate the craftsmanship and history rather than resent the luxury she could never afford. Her own story was simpler, but no less meaningful. Born in rural South Carolina, the daughter of a seamstress and a factory worker, Lila had learned early that dignity wasn't about what you owned, but how you carried yourself. Her mother, Sarah, had raised her with firm rules about respect, hard work, and never forgetting where you came from. The Bible that Lila carried had been Sarah's, filled with handwritten notes in the margins, verses underlined during difficult times, and pressed flowers from significant moments. When Lila's husband James died in a construction accident, leaving her with 8-year-old Marcus and a stack of medical bills, that Bible had become her anchor. She would read from it each morning before work, particularly the passage her mother had marked in Proverbs. "She is clothed with strength and dignity. She can laugh at the days to come." On the hardest days, when Eleanor's words cut particularly deep, Lila would touch the Bible in her purse and remember her mother's dying words. "Keep your head high no matter what. There's nothing wrong with honest work, and there's no shame in serving others as long as you never forget your own worth." Marcus had been the light that kept her going through those early years. Bright, curious, and determined not to let his father's death define their family's future, he had thrown himself into his studies with the intensity that both impressed and worried Lila. She would help him with homework at the small kitchen table in their modest apartment, marveling at how quickly his mind worked. how he seemed to understand instinctively that education was their path to something better. "Mama, why don't you go back to school too?" he had asked once when he was 12, looking up from a math book that already challenged Lila's own understanding. "Someday, baby," she had replied, though they both knew someday was a luxury they couldn't afford. "Right now, my job is making sure you have every opportunity I didn't have." The Prescott household had provided that opportunity, but at a cost that grew heavier each year. Richard, consumed by building his business empire, had gradually withdrawn from the day-to-day life of the house. He would leave before dawn for his downtown office, return after dark, and spend weekends either traveling or locked in his study. With financial reports, his rare appearances in the kitchen or dining room became increasingly brief, his conversations with both Lila and Eleanor reduced to polite but distant exchanges. Eleanor, meanwhile, had filled the vacuum of her husband's attention with social climbing and a need for control that manifested in increasingly unreasonable demands. The woman who had once complimented Lila's work began finding fault with everything: water spots on glassware that only Eleanor could see, dust on baseboards that Lila had cleaned just hours before, flower arrangements that were too colorful or too subdued, depending on Eleanor's mood that day. The turning point had come gradually, so slowly that Lila couldn't pinpoint exactly when Eleanor stopped seeing her as a person and began treating her as an extension of the household fixtures. It started with Eleanor talking about Lila in third person while she was standing right there. "The help needs to pay more attention to the guest bathroom," she would tell Richard, as if Lila were invisible. Then came the snapping of fingers. Instead of using Lila's name, the way Eleanor would interrupt her conversations with delivery workers or gardeners, as if Lila's voice didn't matter. But Lila endured because Marcus needed her to endure. When he earned a full scholarship to pre-med at the University of South Carolina, Lila had wept with pride and relief. When he made the dean's list his first semester, she had carried the letter in her purse for weeks, pulling it out to read, whenever Eleanor's latest humiliation threatened to break her spirit. The job at the Prescotts wasn't just paying for Marcus's education anymore. It was investing in a future where he would never have to bow his head to anyone. The daily routine had become as familiar as breathing. Arrive at 6:30 each morning. Make coffee exactly the way Richard liked it, strong and black, and the way Eleanor preferred it, weak with a precise tablespoon of cream. Prepare breakfast according to whatever diet Eleanor was following that month. Clean the kitchen, dust the downstairs rooms, do the laundry, iron everything including Eleanor's exercise clothes, polish the silver once a week, whether it needed it or not. Change the flowers twice a week, always disposing of arrangements that still had days of life left because Eleanor insisted on freshness. Through it all, Lila had maintained her mother's standard of dignity. She answered Eleanor's increasingly sharp criticisms with, "Yes, ma'am, and I'll take care of that right away." She bit her tongue when Eleanor complained about her work in front of friends, describing Lila's efforts as adequate or satisfactory in a tone that suggested neither was good enough. She never let her face show the pain when Eleanor would schedule dinner parties for 12 people and expect Lila to handle all the preparation and service alone, then criticize her for being slow when she couldn't be in 3 places at once. Other staff members came and went with increasing frequency. Gardeners who quit after Eleanor screamed at them for leaving a single leaf on the pristine lawn. Caterers who refused to return after Eleanor berated them in front of their crews. Even the longtime cook, Mrs. Henderson, had finally given notice. After Eleanor accused her of stealing food, a woman who had been with the family for 15 years and never taken so much as a leftover dinner roll home. "I don't know how you stand it," Mrs. Henderson had said on her last day, packing her knives. With tears in her eyes, that woman has forgotten how to treat people like human beings. But Lila had stood it because she had to, because Marcus's future depended on her ability to swallow her pride one more day, one more year, one more semester until he graduated and could build the kind of life where no one could diminish his worth with a look or a word. Richard, when he was home long enough to notice, seemed oblivious to the change in his wife's behavior. Or perhaps Lila had begun to suspect he had simply chosen not to see it. His business had grown from a regional construction company to a national real estate development firm, and with success had come longer hours, more travel, and an increasing disconnection from the life happening under his own roof. The few times Lila had tried to speak with him about household matters, he had been polite but distracted, signing whatever papers Eleanor put in front of him, approving whatever budget she requested. "You ladies work out the details," he would say with a tired smile. "I trust your judgment." It had taken Lila years to understand that he wasn't including her in that trust. He was simply deferring all domestic decisions to Eleanor, regardless of how those decisions affected the people Eleanor supervised. Now, standing in her small apartment on the evening after her breaking point, Lila held her mother's Bible and wondered if she had finally reached the end of her endurance. 20 years of service, of swallowed pride, of maintaining dignity in the face of increasing disrespect. 20 years of telling herself that she could survive anything for Marcus's sake. But Marcus was graduating in 6 months. His medical school. Applications were already submitted. His MCAT scores strong enough to earn him interviews at several prestigious programs. He was building the future Lila had dreamed of for him. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was time for her to stop sacrificing her own dignity to pay for dreams that were already within reach. The crystal water glass that had triggered Eleanor's latest tirade sat on Lila's kitchen counter now, a simple piece of glassware that had somehow become the symbol of 20 years of accumulated disrespect. She had placed it there deliberately, a reminder that some things were worth more than money, and some lines, once crossed, changed everything that came after. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, and new conversations about dignity, respect, and what it truly meant to build a life of worth. But tonight, for the first time in 20 years, Lila Washington went to sleep without wondering how she would face Eleanor Prescott in the morning. The evening had begun like so many others, with Eleanor's meticulous attention to details that no guest would ever notice, and her increasing agitation about matters that existed only in her own mind. The guest list lay spread across the kitchen counter in Eleanor's precise handwriting. Judge and Mrs. Harrison, the Caldwells from the country club, Dr. Morrison and his new wife, and the Blackwoods, old Charleston money that Eleanor desperately wanted to impress. Lila had arrived 2 hours early to help with preparations, finding Eleanor, already dressed in her navy Chanel suit, pacing the dining room and adjusting place settings that had been perfect the first time. "The flowers are too tall," Eleanor announced without looking at Lila. "Guests won't be able to see each other across the table. Fix them." The arrangements had taken Lila nearly an hour to create that morning. White roses and baby's breath in cut crystal vases, elegant and understated exactly as Eleanor had requested. But Lila simply nodded and began removing stems, shortening the arrangements by 2 inches, while Eleanor continued her nervous supervision. "And make sure the water glasses are spotless," Eleanor added, running her finger along the rim of one glass. "Mrs. Blackwood notices everything, and I won't have her thinking we don't maintain proper standards." Lila polished each glass again, holding them up to the light to check for any trace of water spots or fingerprints. The crystal caught the light from the chandelier, creating tiny rainbows that danced across the white tablecloth. Everything was perfect, as it always was when Lila prepared for Eleanor's dinner parties. The guests arrived promptly at 7, filling the house with the kind of cultivated conversation that mixed business dealings with social gossip and political observations, delivered with the confidence of people who had never doubted their right to opinions on any subject. Lila moved quietly between the kitchen and dining room, serving the first course, a butternut squash soup with creme fraiche that she had prepared from scratch that afternoon. Judge Harrison complimented the soup, and Eleanor accepted the praise with a gracious smile, never mentioning that Lila had created the recipe or spent hours in the kitchen perfecting the seasoning. Dr. Morrison's young wife admired the table setting, and Eleanor launched into a detailed explanation of the china pattern's history, acquired during a trip to England, though it was Lila who had suggested the combination of pieces that made the presentation so striking. The evening proceeded smoothly. Through the second course, herb-crusted salmon with roasted vegetables, and into the main discussion about the city's upcoming development projects. Richard had finally joined the conversation, his business expertise making him the center of attention as he explained the complexities of waterfront zoning and historic preservation requirements. It was during this discussion, as Lila was refilling wine glasses and preparing to serve dessert, that the moment arrived. Judge Harrison had been making a point about property values when he reached for his water glass, knocking it slightly askew in his enthusiasm. The glass remained upright, the water unspilled, but it now sat 2 inches from its original position. Beside his bread plate, Lila, noticing the misplacement as she passed behind the judge's chair, quietly reached over and moved the glass back to its proper position. It was the kind of subtle service that good staff provided without interruption, anticipating needs, correcting small problems before they became larger ones, maintaining the perfect atmosphere that allowed guests to focus on conversation rather than logistics. But Eleanor saw the adjustment, and something in her expression shifted. Perhaps it was the stress of hosting people whose approval she desperately craved, or the 3 glasses of wine she had consumed to calm her nerves, or simply the culmination of years of needing someone to blame for her own insecurities. Whatever the cause, Eleanor's reaction was swift and devastating. "Lila!" she snapped, her voice cutting through the dinner conversation like a blade. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" The dining room fell silent. 8 guests turned to look at Lila, who stood frozen beside Judge Harrison's chair, her hand still extended toward the repositioned water glass. Lila began quietly. "You were just disrupting our guests' dinner," Eleanor continued, her voice rising. "Do you think Judge Harrison is incapable of managing his own water glass? Do you think our guests need you hovering over them, rearranging things they haven't asked you to touch?" Judge Harrison looked uncomfortable, starting to speak in Lila's defense, but Eleanor wasn't finished. 20 years I've tried to teach you proper service, and you still don't understand basic boundaries. You don't touch a guest's place setting while they're seated. You don't interrupt conversations to fix problems that don't exist. How many times do I have to explain these simple concepts?" The cruelty in Eleanor's tone was unmistakable, made worse by the fact that she was performing for an audience. Mrs. Blackwood exchanged a horrified glance with Mrs. Caldwell. Dr. Morrison stared at his plate. Richard, who had been in the kitchen checking on dessert preparations, was missing the entire scene. "I apologize, Mom," Lila said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You were trying to show off," Eleanor interrupted, "acting like you know better than our guests what they need. This is exactly the kind of presumptuous behavior that makes proper service impossible." The words hit Lila like physical blows. After 20 years of quiet professional service, of anticipating the family's needs, of going above and beyond in countless ways that Eleanor had taken for granted, to be accused of showing off felt like the final betrayal. Judge Harrison cleared his throat. "Mrs. Prescott, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I knocked the glass askew myself, and Lila was simply—" "Judge Harrison, please don't feel you need to make excuses for her," Eleanor said with a tight smile. "I know my staff's limitations better than anyone. That's when it happened." Something inside Lila broke, not dramatically, not with anger or shouting, but with the quiet certainty that comes when a person finally reaches the absolute limit of what they can endure. 20 years of swallowed pride, of bitten tongues, of maintaining dignity in the face of increasing disrespect. It all crystallized in this moment of public humiliation over a water glass that had never needed moving in the first place. "I can't live like this," Lila whispered, her voice so soft that only Mrs. Blackwood, seated closest to her, could hear the words clearly. But the weight of those words seemed to fill the entire room. The simple statement carried 20 years of accumulated pain, of daily diminishments, of treating a good woman like she was invisible or, worse, like she was a problem to be managed rather than a person to be respected. Eleanor, perhaps realizing she had gone too far even by her own standards, attempted to regain control of the situation. "Lila, please just serve dessert and we'll discuss this later." But Lila was no longer listening to Eleanor's instructions. She was thinking about her mother's Bible, about the verses that spoke of dignity and worth, about the promise she had made to keep her head high no matter what. She was thinking about Marcus, who would graduate in 6 months and had already proved that their family's worth wasn't determined by how others chose to treat them. Most of all, she was thinking about the 20 years she had given to this house, this family, this woman who had just humiliated her in front of a room full of people over nothing more significant than a misplaced water glass. It was at this moment that Richard Prescott returned from the kitchen, carrying the dessert tray. Lila had prepared earlier individual chocolate soufflés with raspberry coulis. He stepped into the dining room expecting to find the usual scene of elegant conversation and refined hospitality. Instead, he found his wife standing rigid with anger, his guests looking deeply uncomfortable, and Lila, faithful, dignified Lila, standing beside Judge Harrison's chair with tears threatening to spill from her eyes and her whole body trembling with the effort of maintaining composure. Richard had missed Eleanor's tirade, but he had arrived in time to hear Lila's whispered confession, "I can't live like this." And in that moment, seeing the scene before him, he understood exactly what those words meant and exactly what kind of man he had become by allowing this situation to continue for so long. The crystal water glass sat innocently on the white tablecloth, properly positioned and completely unremarkable, a simple object that had somehow become the catalyst for a conversation that was 20 years overdue. The silence in the dining room stretched for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. Richard stood in the doorway, the dessert tray still in his hands, taking in the scene before him with the analytical mind that had built his business empire. His wife's flushed face and defensive posture, his guests' obvious discomfort and averted eyes, and Lila, steady, reliable Lila, who had been part of his household for 2 decades, standing with her shoulders squared but her hands trembling. "Perhaps," Richard said quietly, setting the tray on the sideboard, "we should serve dessert in the living room. Lila, would you mind bringing coffee for those who'd like it?" His voice was calm, controlled, but there was something in his tone that suggested the evening was effectively over. The guests, grateful for the escape route he had provided, murmured their appreciation for the lovely dinner and began the polite process of departure that would normally take another hour, but tonight was completed in 15 minutes. Eleanor played her part perfectly, accepting compliments on the meal and promising to share recipes she had never created. But Richard could see the tight lines around her eyes, the way her smile never quite reached them. She knew, as he was beginning to understand, that something fundamental had shifted in those few moments he had missed. Once the last guest had left, and Lila had finished cleaning the kitchen, she approached Richard in his study. The military service photo on his desk, a faded image of him in dress uniform at 25, seemed to watch the conversation with the serious eyes of a younger man who had once sworn an oath about duty and honor. "Mr. Prescott," Lila began formally, I want to apologize for any embarrassment I caused this evening. I'll pack my things tonight and be gone by morning." Richard looked up from the financial reports he had been pretending to read, seeing her clearly, perhaps for the first time in years. When had her hair become so grey? When had those lines appeared around her eyes? When had this strong, dignified woman begun carrying herself like someone who expected to be criticized for existing? "Lila," he said, "please sit down. I think we need to talk." She remained standing, her posture straight but her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Sir, I don't think that's appropriate. I've clearly outlived my usefulness here, and it's time for me to move on. What exactly happened in that dining room before I returned?" The question hung in the air between them. Lila's loyalty warred. With her exhaustion, 20 years of never speaking against her employers, battling with the knowledge that silence had brought her to this breaking point. "Mrs. Prescott felt I was out of line," she said carefully. "She was right to correct me." Richard studied her face, seeing past the careful diplomacy to the hurt beneath. "Lila, in 20 years, have I ever known you to be out of line? Have you ever embarrassed this family or failed to perform your duties with absolute professionalism?" The question seemed to surprise her. When was the last time someone had asked her opinion about anything that mattered? "I've always tried to do my best." "Sir, that's not what I asked. Have you ever in 20 years given us anything less than exceptional service?" "No, sir," she admitted quietly. Richard stood and walked to the window overlooking the garden that Lila maintained with the same care she brought to everything else. "Then help me understand why my wife felt the need to humiliate you in front of our guests over what Judge Harrison described as an act of thoughtful service." The words tumbled out before Lila could stop them. "She said I was showing off, that I don't understand boundaries, that after 20 years, I still don't know. Improper service?" Her voice broke slightly on the last words. "Maybe she's right. Maybe I've been fooling myself about the quality of my work." "Lila," Richard's voice was sharp enough to make her look at him directly, "I've built a $50 million company by recognizing talent and dedication. In 20 years, you have never, not once, given me cause to question your judgment, your work ethic, or your character. If my wife suggested otherwise tonight, she was wrong." The simple statement hit Lila with unexpected force. When was the last time someone had defended her work, her character, her worth? She felt tears threatening and struggled to maintain her composure. "I appreciate that, Mr. Prescott, but it doesn't change anything. I can't work in a house where I'm not trusted or respected. I won't put myself through that anymore." Richard turned back to face her, and she saw something in his expression that reminded her of the kind young businessman who had hired her 20 years ago. "What if I told you that you're right, that you shouldn't have to put yourself through, that changes are going to be made, sir? What if I told you that tonight opened my eyes to things I should have seen years ago, that I've been so focused on building wealth that I forgot to pay attention to how that wealth was affecting the people around me?" Lila remained silent, unsure where this conversation was leading. "I want you to take a week off," Richard continued. "Paid leave. Use the time to think about what you want your future to look like. And I want you to know that when you're ready to come back, if you choose to come back, things will be different." "Different how?" Richard picked up the military photo from his desk, studying the young soldier who had once believed that honor meant protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. "Different, because I remember what it means to stand up for what's right, even when it's inconvenient. Different because I've spent too many years letting someone else make decisions about how people are treated in my own home." He set the photo back down and met Lila's eyes directly. "Different because you deserve better than what happened tonight, and it's my responsibility to make sure you get it." Lila felt something shift inside her chest. Not hope exactly, but something like the memory of hope. "And Mrs. Prescott? Mrs. Prescott and I are going to have a very long conversation about respect, dignity, and what it means to be part of this family. That conversation should have happened years ago. For the first time that evening, Lila allowed herself to sit down in the chair across from Richard's desk. "I need to call my son," she said quietly. "I need to tell him what happened tonight." "Of course. And Lila?" Richard's voice was gentle but firm. "When you talk to Marcus, I want you to tell him something else. Tell him that his mother has spent 20 years showing this family what dignity looks like, and that it's time we learned to show her the same respect in return." As Lila left the study, Richard remained at his desk, staring at the young soldier. In the photograph, and wondering how many other things he had chosen not to see in his pursuit of success. Outside, the garden that Lila tended with such care was barely visible in the darkness, but he made a mental note to walk through it tomorrow morning and really look at what she had created there. Some reckonings, he was beginning to understand, were 20 years in the making. Lila woke before dawn, as she had every morning for 20 years, but for the first time in decades, she didn't immediately reach for her work clothes. Instead, she lay in bed listening to the quiet sounds of her neighborhood waking up, cars starting for early commutes, the distant hum of traffic on the interstate, the cheerful chatter of birds that she rarely had time to notice. On her nightstand, next to her mother's worn Bible, sat Marcus's college acceptance letter, carefully preserved in a plastic sleeve, though she had memorized every word years ago. The University of South Carolina School of Medicine had been his dream since he was 12 years old, inspired by the doctor who had tried so hard to save his father. Now, at 28, he was just months away from graduation and his residency match. On her nightstand, next to her mother's worn Bible, sat Marcus's college acceptance letter, carefully preserved in a plastic sleeve, though she had memorized every word years ago. The University of South Carolina School of Medicine had been his dream since he was 12 years old, inspired by the doctor who had tried so hard to save his father. Now, at 28, he was just months away from graduation and his residency match. So she had told him about the water glass, about Eleanor's public humiliation, about 20 years of accumulated disrespect finally reaching a breaking point. She had told him about Richard's unexpected support and his promise that things would change, though she wasn't sure what that meant or whether she could trust it. "I'm proud of you," Marcus had said simply. "It took courage to say what you said. Tonight, Dad would be proud too." Now, in the morning light, Lila wondered if courage was the right word for what she had done. It felt more like desperation, like the instinctive reaction of someone who had finally been pushed too far. But perhaps there wasn't much difference between courage and desperation when it came to standing up for your own dignity. She made coffee in her small kitchen, stronger than she usually liked it, and sat at the table where Marcus had done his homework all those years. The apartment was quiet in a way that the Prescott house never was. No schedule to maintain, no meals to prepare, no one waiting for her to anticipate their needs before they expressed them. It was both peaceful and terrifying. At 9 o'clock, her phone rang. She expected it to be Richard, perhaps changing his mind about the paid leave, or Eleanor demanding that she return immediately to clean up whatever chaos her absence had created. Instead, it was Marcus. "I'm driving down," he announced without preamble. "I'll be there by lunch. Marcus, you have classes. Mom, my mother just stood up to 20 years of injustice. My classes can wait for one day. We're going to figure this out together." 3 hours later, Marcus Washington walked into his mother's apartment, carrying groceries and wearing the determined expression that had gotten him through pre-med at USC. At 28, he had grown into the kind of man his father would have been proud of, tall and lean like James had been, but with Lila's thoughtful eyes and steady presence. "First things first," he said, unpacking ingredients for lunch. "You're going to eat something besides toast and coffee, and then we're going to talk about what you want your life to look like going forward." Lila watched her son move confidently around her kitchen, preparing vegetables for a salad with the same precise attention to detail he brought to his medical studies. When had he become the one taking care of her? I don't know what I want, she admitted as they sat down to eat. For 20 years I've only thought about getting you through school. I never planned for what comes after. Well, what comes after is in 4 months when I graduate, and 3 months after that when I start my residency in pediatrics at Charleston Children's Hospital, Marcus said, which means you don't have to sacrifice your dignity for my education anymore. That chapter is over, Mom. Now we get to write a new one. The relief in his voice was unmistakable, and Lila realized that her son had been carrying his own burden all these years, the knowledge that his dreams were being paid for with his mother's daily humiliation. I'm not ungrateful for what the Prescotts provided, she said carefully. The job paid for your education, for this apartment, for Mom. Marcus's voice was gentle but firm. Being grateful for a paycheck doesn't mean you have to accept being treated like you don't matter. You taught me that my worth isn't determined by what other people think of me. It's time you remembered that lesson applies to you too. They spent the afternoon talking about possibilities neither had dared to discuss before. Marcus's residency would provide enough income to help support them both modestly. Lila could look for a different kind of work, maybe at a school, where her organizational skills and nurturing nature would be appreciated rather than taken for granted. Or she could finally take some of those college courses she had always talked about someday pursuing. The point is, Marcus said as they cleaned up lunch dishes together, you have choices now, real choices. You don't have to go back to the Prescotts if you don't want to. And if you do go back, it has to be on your terms, with the respect and dignity you've always deserved. At 4 o'clock, Richard Prescott called. Marcus answered the phone, introducing himself politely and explaining that he was visiting his mother to discuss recent events. Mr. Washington, Richard said, I wonder if I might speak with you and your mother together. There are some things I'd like to discuss, if you're willing. They agreed to meet at a coffee shop downtown, neutral territory where the conversation could happen between equals rather than in the context of employer and employee. As they drove into the city, Lila felt nervous, but also something she hadn't experienced in years when it came to the Prescotts, curiosity about what Richard might have to say. The afternoon sun slanted through the coffee shop windows as they waited for Richard to arrive, and Lila found herself thinking about the young businessman who had hired her 20 years ago. Had he really changed so much, or had she simply stopped looking for the decent man she had once respected? Marcus reached across the table and squeezed her hand. Whatever he has to say, remember that you get to decide what happens next. Not him, not Mrs. Prescott, not anyone but you. For the first time in 20 years, Lila Washington felt like she had the power to shape her own future. It was a feeling worth protecting. Richard Prescott arrived at the coffee shop carrying a worn leather portfolio filled with business cards he had collected over 20 years of networking. Each card represented relationships built on mutual respect and professional courtesy, values he was beginning to realize he had failed to maintain in his own home. As he approached the table where Lila and Marcus waited, he found himself genuinely nervous for the first time in years. Marcus stood to shake his hand, and Richard was struck by the young man's composure and dignity. This was the son Lila had worked so hard to educate, the future doctor whose dreams had cost his mother 20 years of enduring daily humiliation. Looking at Marcus, Richard felt a deep shame about his own complicity in that sacrifice. Thank you both for agreeing to meet with me, Richard began once they were seated. I want to start by saying something I should have said years ago. Lila, I owe you an apology that goes far beyond what happened last night. Lila remained silent, her hands folded in her lap, but Marcus leaned forward slightly. What kind of apology, Mr. Prescott? Richard opened his portfolio and pulled out a small notebook, the kind he used for jotting down business ideas and important reminders. Over the past day, he had filled several pages with uncomfortable observations about his own household. I've spent the last 24 hours thinking about how many times I've walked through my own house and chosen not to see what was happening right in front of me, he said. How many times I heard my wife speak to your mother in ways I would never tolerate in my business dealings, and I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere in domestic matters. He flipped through his notes, reading his own handwriting as if seeing it for the first time. Yesterday, I called 3 former employees who worked for us over the years. The gardener who quit last spring, Mrs. Henderson who cooked for us for 15 years, the cleaning service that stopped coming 2 years ago. Marcus and Lila exchanged glances. They both remembered those departures, the pattern of good people, who simply stopped showing up for work without explanation. Every single one of them told me the same story, Richard continued. They quit because of how my wife treated them, not because of the work, not because of the pay, but because Eleanor had made their jobs unbearable through constant criticism, impossible demands, and what Mrs. Henderson called a complete lack of basic human decency. Lila felt a mixture of vindication and sadness. She had suspected that Eleanor's behavior had driven others away, but hearing it confirmed made her realize how isolated she had become in her determination to endure what others had found intolerable. Mrs. Henderson told me something else, Richard said, looking directly at Lila. She said that in 15 years of working for us, you were the only staff member who ever treated her as an equal, that you shared your lunch with her, asked about her grandchildren, and covered for her. When she was struggling with arthritis in her hands, Marcus smiled slightly. That sounded exactly like his mother. She also told me, Richard continued, his voice quieter now, that you had been doing half her job for the last 3 years, managing meal planning, grocery ordering, special dietary, requirements for my business dinners. But Eleanor insisted on giving you no credit and no additional compensation because housekeeping staff don't make decisions about menus. The revelation hung in the air between them. Lila had never complained about the additional responsibilities, had never asked for recognition or extra pay. She had simply seen needs and filled them, the way she had been raised to approach work and life. I've also been reviewing our household budget, Richard said, opening another section of his notebook. Over the past 5 years, Eleanor has requested increases in the domestic staff budget 6 times. Each time I approved the increase without question, assuming it meant better working conditions or additional help for you. He showed them a page of figures that made Marcus whistle softly under his breath. Instead, that money went to hiring temporary caterers for small dinner parties you could have handled yourself, buying expensive cleaning products that duplicated supplies we already had, and paying premium rates for services that were unnecessary given the excellent work you were already providing. Lila stared at the numbers, realizing that Eleanor had been profiting from her efficiency by charging Richard for services that weren't needed while simultaneously criticizing the quality of the work being done. But the most damning thing I discovered, Richard said, closing the notebook, came from my business partner, James Morrison. You met his wife at dinner last night, the young woman who complimented our table setting. Marcus nodded, remembering his mother's description of the evening. James called me this morning. His wife couldn't stop talking about what she witnessed last night, how appalled she was by Eleanor's behavior. She made coffee in her small kitchen, stronger than she usually liked it, and sat at the table where Marcus had done his homework all those years. The apartment was quiet in a way that the Prescott house never was. No schedule to maintain, no meals to prepare, no one waiting for her to anticipate their needs before they expressed them. It was both peaceful and terrifying. At 9 o'clock, her phone rang. She expected it to be Richard, perhaps changing his mind about the paid leave, or Eleanor demanding that she return immediately to clean up whatever chaos her absence had created. Instead, it was Marcus. I'm driving down, he announced without preamble. I'll be there by lunch. Marcus, you have classes. Mom, my mother just stood up to 20 years of injustice. My classes can wait for one day. We're going to figure this out together. 3 hours later, Marcus Washington walked into his mother's apartment, carrying groceries and wearing the determined expression that had gotten him through pre-med at USC. At 28, he had grown into the kind of man his father would have been proud of, tall and lean like James had been, but with Lila's thoughtful eyes and steady presence. "First things first," he said, unpacking ingredients for lunch. "You're going to eat something besides toast and coffee, and then we're going to talk about what you want your life to look like going forward." Lila watched her son move confidently around her kitchen, preparing vegetables for a salad with the same precise attention to detail he brought to his medical studies. When had he become the one taking care of her? "I don't know what I want," she admitted as they sat down to eat. "For 20 years I've only thought about getting you through school. I never planned for what comes after." "Well, what comes after is in 4 months when I graduate, and 3 months after that when I start my residency in pediatrics at Charleston Children's Hospital," Marcus said. "Which means you don't have to sacrifice your dignity for my education anymore. That chapter is over, Mom. Now we get to write a new one." The relief in his voice was unmistakable, and Lila realized that her son had been carrying his own burden all these years. The knowledge that his dreams were being paid for, with his mother's daily humiliation. "I'm not ungrateful for what the Prescotts provided," she said carefully. "The job paid for your education, for this apartment, for—" "Mom." Marcus's voice was gentle but firm. "Being grateful for a paycheck doesn't mean you have to accept being treated like you don't matter. You taught me that my worth isn't determined by what other people think of me. It's time you remembered that lesson applies to you too." They spent the afternoon talking about possibilities neither had dared to discuss before. Marcus's residency would provide enough income to help support them both modestly. Lila could look for a different kind of work, maybe at a school where her organizational skills and nurturing nature would be appreciated rather than taken for granted. Or she could finally take some of those college courses she had always talked about someday pursuing. "The point is," Marcus said as they cleaned up lunch dishes together, "you have choices now. Real choices. You don't have to go back to the Prescotts if you don't want to. And if you do go back, it has to be on your terms, with the respect and dignity you've always deserved." At 4 o'clock, Richard Prescott called. Marcus answered the phone, introducing himself politely and explaining that he was visiting his mother to discuss recent events. "Mr. Washington," Richard said, "I wonder if I might speak with you and your mother together. There are some things I'd like to discuss, if you're willing." They agreed to meet at a coffee shop downtown, neutral territory where the conversation could happen between equals rather than in the context of employer and employee. As they drove into the city, Lila felt nervous, but also something she hadn't experienced in years when it came to the Prescotts: curiosity about what Richard might have to say. The afternoon sun slanted through the coffee shop windows as they waited for Richard to arrive, and Lila found herself thinking about the young businessman who had hired her 20 years ago. Had he really changed so much, or had she simply stopped looking for the decent man she had once respected? Marcus reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Whatever he has to say, remember that you get to decide what happens next. Not him, not Mrs. Prescott, not anyone but you." For the first time in 20 years, Lila Washington felt like she had the power to shape her own future. It was a feeling worth protecting. Richard Prescott arrived at the coffee shop carrying a worn leather portfolio filled with business cards he had collected over 20 years of networking. Each card represented relationships built on mutual respect and professional courtesy, values he was beginning to realize he had failed to maintain in his own home. As he approached the table where Lila and Marcus waited, he found himself genuinely nervous for the first time in years. Marcus stood to shake his hand, and Richard was struck by the young man's composure and dignity. This was the son Lila had worked so hard to educate, the future doctor whose dreams had cost his mother 20 years of enduring daily humiliation. Looking at Marcus, Richard felt a deep shame about his own complicity in that sacrifice. "Thank you both for agreeing to meet with me," Richard began, once they were seated. "I want to start by saying something I should have said years ago. Lila, I owe you an apology that goes far beyond what happened last night." Lila remained silent, her hands folded in her lap, but Marcus leaned forward slightly. "What kind of apology, Mr. Prescott?" Richard opened his portfolio and pulled out a small notebook, the kind he used for jotting down business ideas and important reminders. Over the past day, he had filled several pages with uncomfortable observations about his own household. "I've spent the last 24 hours thinking about how many times I've walked through my own house and chosen not to see what was happening right in front of me," he said. "How many times I heard my wife speak to your mother in ways I would never tolerate in my business dealings, and I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere in domestic matters." He flipped through his notes, reading his own handwriting as if seeing it for the first time. "Yesterday I called 3 former employees who worked for us over the years. The gardener who quit last spring, Mrs. Henderson, who cooked for us for 15 years, the cleaning service that stopped coming 2 years ago." Marcus and Lila exchanged glances. They both remembered those departures, the pattern of good people who simply stopped showing up for work without explanation. "Every single one of them told me the same story," Richard continued. "They quit because of how my wife treated them. Not because of the work, not because of the pay, but because Eleanor had made their jobs unbearable through constant criticism, impossible demands, and what Mrs. Henderson called a complete lack of basic human decency." Lila felt a mixture of vindication and sadness. She had suspected that Eleanor's behavior had driven others away, but hearing it confirmed made her realize how isolated she had become in her determination to endure what others had found intolerable. "Mrs. Henderson told me something else," Richard said, looking directly at Lila. "She said that in 15 years of working for us, you were the only staff member who ever treated her as an equal, that you shared your lunch with her, asked about her grandchildren, and covered for her when she was struggling with arthritis in her hands." Marcus smiled slightly. That sounded exactly like his mother. "She also told me," Richard continued, his voice quieter now, "that you had been doing half her job for the last 3 years, managing meal planning, grocery ordering, special dietary requirements for my business dinners, but Eleanor insisted on giving you no credit and no additional compensation because housekeeping staff don't make decisions about menus." The revelation hung in the air between them. Lila had never complained about the additional responsibilities, had never asked for recognition or extra pay. She had simply seen needs and filled them, the way she had been raised to approach work and life. "I've also been reviewing our household budget," Richard said, opening another section of his notebook. "Over the past 5 years, Eleanor has requested increases in the domestic staff budget 6 times. Each time, I approved the increase without question, assuming it meant better working conditions or additional help for you." He showed them a page of figures that made Marcus whistle softly under his breath. Instead, that money went to hiring temporary caterers for small dinner parties you could have handled yourself, buying expensive cleaning products that duplicated supplies we already had, and paying premium rates for services that were unnecessary given the excellent work you were already providing. Lila stared at the numbers, realizing that Eleanor had been profiting from her efficiency by charging Richard for services that weren't needed while simultaneously criticizing the quality of the work being done. "But the most damning thing I discovered," Richard said, closing the notebook, "came from my business partner, James Morrison. You met his wife at dinner last night, the young woman who complimented our table setting." Marcus nodded, remembering his mother's description of the evening. "James called me this morning. His wife couldn't stop talking about what she witnessed last night, how appalled she was by Eleanor's behavior. But James told me something else, Apparently, Eleanor has been telling people at the country club for years that she does all her own entertaining, that she has a gift for hospitality and manages our household without any help. The cruelty of this revelation was breathtaking. Not only had Eleanor been taking credit for Lila's work, she had been actively erasing Lila's existence from the narrative of their social life. Marcus spoke for the first time since they had sat down. "Mr. Prescott, I appreciate you sharing this information with us, but I have to ask, what are you planning to do about it?" Richard met the young man's steady gaze, seeing in Marcus's eyes the same strength and dignity that had allowed Lila to endure 20 years of disrespect without losing her sense of self-worth. "I'm planning to have a very serious conversation with my wife about the kind of person she's become and the kind of household we're going to run going forward," Richard said. "I'm also planning to make some changes that are long overdue." "What kind of changes?" Lila asked quietly. Richard pulled a business card from his portfolio, his own card, with his direct office number written on the back in his handwriting. "For starters, I want you to know that if you choose to continue working for our family, you'll be reporting directly to me, not to Eleanor. You'll have input on household budget decisions, recognition for the innovations you bring to our home, management and the respect you should have been receiving all along." He paused, then added, "And I want you to know that whether you decide to stay or not, I'm going to make sure that what happened to you doesn't happen to anyone else who works in our home." Lila looked at the business card in her hands, feeling the weight of 20 years of patience finally being acknowledged. But she also felt the uncertainty of not knowing whether people could really change, whether promises made in guilt and shame would hold up under the daily pressures of old habits and established patterns. "I need time to think," she said finally. "Of course," Richard replied. "Take all the time you need. Just know that whatever you decide, you have my respect and my gratitude for 20 years of exceptional service that I failed to properly appreciate." As they prepared to leave, Marcus shook Richard's hand again. "Mr. Prescott, my mother has given your family the best years of her working life. If she decides to come back, I hope you'll remember that trust, once broken, takes time to rebuild." Richard nodded, understanding that he was not just asking for Lila's forgiveness, but earning the respect of a son who had watched his mother sacrifice too much for too long. Outside the coffee shop, as they walked to their car, Marcus put his arm around his mother's shoulders. "What are you thinking, Mom?" Lila looked back at the coffee shop where Richard still sat, staring at his notebook full of uncomfortable truths. "I'm thinking that some people can change," she said slowly. "The question is whether I'm ready to find out if he's one of them." Lila spent the next 3 days immersed in a routine she hadn't experienced in decades, time that belonged entirely to her. She slept past 6:30, made breakfast without considering anyone else's dietary preferences, and sat in her small garden, reading her mother's handwritten recipes, which she had collected over the years in a simple composition notebook. Each page represented not just ingredients and instructions, but memories of family gatherings, church potlucks, and the cultural traditions that Eleanor had unknowingly benefited from but never acknowledged. The sweet potato pie recipe on page 12 had been the highlight of the Prescott's Thanksgiving dinners for 15 years, though Eleanor always presented it to guests as our traditional family dessert. The herbed cornbread on page 23 had become Richard's favorite accompaniment to winter stews, though he had never known it came from Lila's grandmother's kitchen in rural Beaufort County. Page after page revealed the quiet ways Lila had brought her own heritage and creativity to the Prescott household, contributions that had been absorbed and claimed without recognition or appreciation. On Thursday morning, Richard called with an update that changed everything Lila thought. She knew about her situation. "I need to see you again," he said without preamble. "Both you and Marcus, if he's still in town. I've discovered some things that go beyond Eleanor's treatment of staff." They met again at the coffee shop, but this time Richard's demeanor was different, more serious, more troubled. He carried a manila folder instead of his leather portfolio, and the contents seemed to weigh more heavily on his mind than his previous revelations about household management. "I've been reviewing our financial records," he began once they were seated. "All of them, including accounts I normally leave to Eleanor to manage. What I found is worse than I imagined." He opened the folder carefully, as if the papers inside might burn him. "For the past 5 years, Eleanor has been managing our household budget through a separate account that I established to streamline domestic expenses. I gave her complete control over it, with automatic monthly deposits that were supposed to cover staff wages, household supplies, maintenance, and entertaining expenses." Marcus leaned forward, his medical training making him attuned to the gravity in Richard's voice. "What did you find?" "I found that Eleanor has been systematically skimming money from that account for her personal use," Richard said quietly. "Money that was supposed to pay for household staff wages, equipment maintenance, and legitimate entertaining expenses has been diverted to her personal shopping, spa treatments, and what appear to be significant gambling losses at the casino." Lila felt a chill run through her. "My wages have been paid from my personal account for the past 2 years, though Eleanor was receiving money specifically designated for your salary," Richard confirmed. "In effect, I've been paying you twice, once directly and once through money Eleanor was supposed to be managing on my behalf." The implications were staggering. Not only had Eleanor been emotionally abusive, she had been stealing money meant for Lila's compensation, while simultaneously criticizing her work and value to the household. "There's more," Richard continued, his voice heavy with shame. "The foundation I established 3 years ago to support community education programs. It's been funding Eleanor's lifestyle instead of helping local students. Money that was supposed to provide scholarships for families like yours has been paying for Eleanor's country club memberships and shopping trips to Atlanta." Marcus's jaw tightened. His mother had worked for 20 years to afford his education, sacrificing her dignity daily, while Eleanor was stealing money that could have helped other families avoid that same struggle. "How much money are we talking about?" Marcus asked. Richard consulted his notes, though the numbers were clearly burned into his memory. "Over the past 5 years, approximately $200,000 that should have gone to community programs and fair staff compensation." The figure hung in the air like a physical weight. Lila had never imagined that kind of money, had never dreamed that her years of careful budgeting and sacrifice were happening in a household where that amount could disappear without the primary earner even noticing. "What I don't understand," Lila said slowly, "is why Eleanor would risk so much for money she didn't really need. Your family has more wealth than most people can imagine." Richard was quiet for a long moment, staring at the financial documents spread before him. "I think Eleanor has been living with the fear that our success isn't permanent, that somehow she needs to accumulate her own resources in case everything falls apart. But instead of talking to me about financial security, she chose to steal from programs meant to help people and from wages meant for the person who kept our household running." He looked up at Lila with an expression of profound regret. "I also think she's been resentful of your role in our home for years. You've been the one ensuring everything runs smoothly, anticipating problems, managing details that make our lives comfortable. Eleanor has felt displaced by your competence, and rather than appreciating what you bring to our family, she's tried to diminish your value while literally stealing your compensation." Marcus spoke up, his voice carefully controlled. "Mr. Prescott, what exactly are you planning to do with this information?" "I'm filing for divorce," Richard said without hesitation. "I'm also turning the financial documentation over to my attorneys to determine what criminal charges might be appropriate. Theft from a charitable foundation is a serious crime, and I won't protect Eleanor from the consequences of her choices." Lila felt a mixture of vindication and sadness. She had never wanted Eleanor's marriage to end, had never sought revenge for years of mistreatment. But she also understood that some betrayals went too deep, For forgiveness or reconciliation? What does this mean for me?" she asked. Richard pulled out a check from the folder, not a paycheck, but something more substantial. "This represents the money that should have been paid to you over the past 2 years, plus compensation for additional responsibilities you took on without recognition or appropriate pay. It's not enough to make up for 20 years of being undervalued, but it's a start." Lila looked at the check and felt tears welling in her eyes. The amount would give her complete financial independence for the first time in her adult life, would allow her to make choices about her future based on what she wanted rather than what she needed to survive. "There's something else," Richard said. "I want to offer you a position as household manager, not as domestic staff, but as a management position with a salary commensurate with your skills and experience. You would oversee all domestic operations, have input on budgets and staffing decisions, and receive the recognition and respect your work has always deserved." Marcus reached over and squeezed his mother's hand. After 20 years of having her contributions ignored or diminished, she was finally being offered acknowledgement of her true value. But Lila surprised them both with her response. "I need to think about it," she said. "Not about the money, I'm grateful for that beyond words, but about whether I want to continue working in a house with so many painful memories, even under better circumstances." Richard nodded with understanding. "Whatever you decide, you have my support. And Lila, you should know that your courage in speaking up has probably saved other families from what you've endured. The changes I'm making will protect future employees and ensure that our charitable giving actually reaches the people it's meant to help." As they left the coffee shop, Lila carried with her not just a check that represented financial freedom, but the knowledge that her 20 years of quiet dignity had finally been recognized and valued. The question now was whether she wanted to rebuild something new from the ashes of what had been broken, or whether it was time to start completely fresh. 2 weeks after their last meeting, Richard called Lila with a request that surprised her. "I want to show you something," he said. "Something I've been working on that I think you need to see before you make your final decision about the future." They met not at the coffee shop this time, but at a small office building downtown that Lila had passed countless times but never paid much attention to. Richard led her through a modest lobby to a suite on the 3rd floor, where freshly painted walls displayed architectural plans, community demographic studies, and what appeared to be the organizational structure for a non-profit foundation. But what caught Lila's attention immediately was the nameplate on the main desk, the Lila Washington Foundation for Domestic Worker Rights and Education. She stared at the sign, reading her own name in brass letters, feeling a mixture of overwhelming gratitude and complete bewilderment. "Richard, what is this?" "This," he said, settling into a chair across from her, "is what I've been working on. Since our conversation about Eleanor's financial crimes, I realized that returning stolen money to you and firing my wife wasn't enough. The problems you've faced aren't unique to our household. They're systemic issues that affect domestic workers throughout the region." He walked her through the plans covering the conference table. The foundation would provide legal support for domestic workers facing exploitation, educational scholarships for workers seeking career advancement, and advocacy for stronger labor. Protections at the state level. It would also offer financial literacy classes, job placement services, and emergency assistance for workers who found themselves suddenly unemployed due to employer retaliation. "The seed funding comes from 3 sources," Richard explained. "The money Eleanor stole from our previous charitable foundation, a substantial contribution from my personal assets, and matching funds from several business associates who were appalled when I told them what had been happening in my own home." Lila walked around the office, touching the plans and reading the mission statement that seemed to articulate everything she had experienced but never had the platform to express. "Why my name?" she asked quietly. "Because you're the person who made me understand that this isn't about individual charity or guilt," Richard said. "It's about systemic change. Your courage in saying, "I can't live like this," didn't just change our household, it opened my eyes to how many other people are living with the same lack of dignity and respect. The foundation papers spread across the desk represented more than Richard's guilt or gratitude. They represented a commitment to ensuring that other domestic workers wouldn't have to choose between financial survival and personal dignity the way Lila had for 20 years. "I've already spoken with 3 law firms that specialize in labor rights," Richard continued. "They're prepared to provide pro bono legal services for workers facing wage theft, unsafe working conditions, or discriminatory treatment. I've also established partnerships with 2 community colleges to provide tuition assistance for domestic workers who want to pursue additional education or career training." Lila picked up a folder labeled Advisory Board and found her own name listed as the proposed executive director, followed by Marcus's name as a board member and several other names she recognized from the community: social workers, educators, and advocates who had been fighting for worker rights for years. "You want me to run this?" she asked, still processing the scope of what Richard was proposing. "I want you to lead it," he corrected. "There's a difference between running an organization and truly leading a movement. You understand these issues from the inside in a way that I never could. You know what it feels like to have your work devalued, your contributions ignored, your dignity questioned on a daily basis." The weight of the opportunity was both exhilarating and terrifying. Lila had spent 20 years being told that her opinions didn't matter, that her role was to follow instructions rather than make decisions. Now Richard was asking her to become the public face of a foundation dedicated to protecting other people facing the same challenges she had endured. "What about Eleanor?" Lila asked. "How has she responded to all of this?" Richard's expression darkened. "Eleanor has hired a team of attorneys and is threatening to fight both the divorce and the criminal charges. She's also attempting to discredit you publicly, telling anyone who will listen that you were an unreliable employee who stole from our household and that I'm only supporting you now because I'm having some kind of midlife crisis." The cruelty of Eleanor's response shouldn't have surprised Lila, but it still stung. Even facing the consequences of her own crimes, Eleanor was determined to destroy Lila's reputation rather than take responsibility for her actions. She's also threatened to claim that the foundation is just an elaborate scheme to hide assets from the divorce settlement, Richard continued, "which is why I've established it as completely independent from my personal finances and why I've invited outside oversight from established charitable organizations." Lila sat down at the desk with her nameplate, imagining herself in this role, speaking at conferences, advocating for legislation, providing support to workers who felt as powerless as she had felt just weeks ago. It was a vision of herself that she had never dared to imagine. "Marcus thinks I should do it," she said quietly. "He says that everything I've been through has prepared me for exactly this kind of work. He also says that my mother would be proud to see her daughter's name on something that helps other families." Richard pulled out one more document from the foundation papers, a scholarship program specifically designed to support the children of domestic workers pursuing higher education. "The first scholarship will be awarded in Marcus's name," he said. "Not because he needs the money at this point, but because his success represents what's possible when families are given the support they need to pursue their dreams." The gesture moved Lila to tears. For 20 years, she had sacrificed her own dignity to pay for Marcus's education. Now, Richard was proposing to honor that sacrifice by helping other families avoid the same impossible choices. "There's one more thing," Richard said, handing her a final folder. "If you accept the position as executive director, you'll be working with a board of advisors that includes Judge Harrison, the man who tried to defend you at that dinner party." When I told him about the foundation, he immediately volunteered to provide legal expertise and help us navigate the regulatory requirements for charitable organizations. Lila remembered Judge Harrison's uncomfortable expression that night, his attempt to intervene when Eleanor was humiliating her. Knowing that he had been troubled enough by what he witnessed to volunteer his time for this cause made her feel that her courage in speaking up had resonated with more people than she realized. "I need to ask you something honestly," Lila said, looking directly at Richard. "Is this foundation about helping domestic workers, or is it about easing your guilt over 20 years of allowing your wife to mistreat me?" Richard considered the question carefully before answering. "It started as guilt," he admitted, "but it's become something more important than that. It's become about recognition that individual kindness isn't enough when the systems themselves are designed to exploit vulnerable workers. Your situation opened my eyes to how many people are suffering in silence, and I want to use my resources and privilege to create lasting change rather than just offering charity to individual cases." He paused, then added, "But you're right to question my motives. That's exactly why you're the right person to lead this foundation, because you won't let it become about my redemption story instead of real advocacy for workers' rights." Lila looked around the office one more time, imagining the conversations that could happen here, the support that could be provided, the lives that could be changed. For 20 years, she had endured injustice in isolation. Now she had the opportunity to ensure that other workers wouldn't have to face those challenges alone. "I'll do it," she said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "But I have some conditions of my own about how this foundation will operate." Richard smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen from him since this whole situation began. "I wouldn't expect anything less from the woman who had the courage to say, 'I can't live like this,' and mean it." The foundation papers, spread before them, represented more than a new career opportunity for Lila. They represented the transformation of 20 years of quiet suffering into a platform for advocacy, justice, and systemic change. Her mother's Bible had taught her to maintain dignity in the face of adversity. Now, she would have the opportunity to help ensure that others wouldn't have to test that strength the way she had been forced to for so long. 3 weeks into her new role as executive director of the Lila Washington Foundation, Lila found herself facing a challenge she had never imagined, preparing to tell her story on live television. The local news interview had been Judge Harrison's suggestion, a way to raise awareness about domestic worker rights while announcing the foundation's launch to the community. The appointment card sat on her kitchen table like a small white rectangle of terror. Channel 7 News, live interview, Thursday, 9 a.m. Such simple words to represent something that felt monumentally overwhelming to a woman who had spent 20 years trying to remain invisible. Marcus had driven down from Colombia again, bringing with him a confidence that Lila envied and a determination to support his mother through what he insisted on calling your moment to change the conversation. "Mom, you've been advocating for yourself and others quietly for decades," he said as they sat at her kitchen table the night before the interview. "Tomorrow, you just get to do it out loud, where people can hear you and learn from your experience. What if I say the wrong thing? What if I can't explain it properly? What if people think I'm just complaining about a job that paid me well for 20 years? Marcus reached across the table and took her hands. "What if you say exactly what needs to be said? What if your words help someone else find the courage to stand up for their own dignity? What if you change the way people think about domestic or work and the people who do it?" Richard had offered to accompany her to the studio, but Lila had declined. This interview needed to be her voice, her story, told in her words, without the presence of her former employer potentially influencing how viewers interpreted her experience. The foundation office had become a hub of activity in preparation for the interview's aftermath. 3 volunteer coordinators were standing by to handle calls from workers seeking assistance, and Judge Harrison had arranged for 2 additional attorneys to provide emergency consultations for anyone who might come forward with serious legal issues. "We're prepared for a significant response," Judge Harrison had told Lila during their final preparation meeting. "Your story resonates because it's not unique. There are hundreds of domestic workers in this region who have faced similar treatment, and many of them have been waiting for someone to speak up first." Eleanor, meanwhile, had not been idle. Through mutual friends, Lila had learned that Eleanor was conducting her own campaign to discredit both the foundation and Lila's credibility. She had hired a public relations firm to manage her reputation during the divorce proceedings, and was reportedly preparing her own media appearances to counter whatever Lila might say. "Let her," Marcus had said when Lila expressed concern about Eleanor's efforts. "Truth doesn't need a PR campaign. Your 20 years of faithful service speak for themselves, and anyone who knows you understands your character." The morning of the interview, Lila woke before dawn and spent an hour with her mother's Bible, reading the passages that had sustained her through the most difficult times. The verses about strength and dignity seemed especially relevant as she prepared to speak publicly about experiences she had kept private for so long. She dressed carefully, not in the uniform-like clothing she had worn at the Prescotts, but in the navy blue dress that Marcus had helped her choose, something that conveyed professionalism and dignity without pretension. Her appearance needed to reflect the gravity of the issues she was discussing, while remaining approachable to viewers who might be facing similar challenges. At the studio, the producer briefed her on the interview format: 7 minutes of live television to explain 20 years of experience, to make viewers understand the difference between legitimate employment and systematic exploitation, to demonstrate why domestic worker rights mattered to the broader community. "Just tell your story honestly," the interviewer Sarah Chen advised during their pre-interview conversation. "People can sense authenticity, and your experience speaks for itself. Don't worry about being perfect. Worry about being real." As Lila sat in the makeup chair, she thought about all the mornings she had prepared for Eleanor's dinner parties, making sure every detail was perfect while knowing she would receive no credit for her work. Now she was preparing to speak on television about the value of that work and the dignity of the people who performed it. The studio lights were brighter than she had expected, and the camera seemed impossibly large and intimidating. But when Sarah Chen introduced her and asked her first question, "Can you tell us what it was like to work as a domestic employee for 20 years?" Lila found her voice steady and clear. "It was both a privilege and a challenge," she began, the words coming more easily than she had anticipated. "I was privileged to work in a beautiful home, to be trusted with the daily operations of a household, to help create an environment where a family could thrive. But it was challenging because over time, I began to feel invisible, like my contributions didn't matter and my dignity wasn't respected." Sarah leaned forward slightly. "Can you give us a specific example of what you mean by not feeling respected?" Lila thought about the water glass, about 20 years of accumulated small humiliations, about Eleanor taking credit for her recipes and innovations while criticizing her work in front of guests. There were many small moments that added up over time, she said carefully, being spoken about in third person while I was standing right there, having my work criticized in front of guests for problems that didn't exist, never receiving recognition for innovations I brought to household management, while being blamed for any inconvenience, no matter how minor." The interviewer nodded. "What was the moment that made you realize you couldn't continue?" "It was at a dinner party," Lila said, feeling the weight of that evening in her voice. "I was humiliated in front of guests over something as small as repositioning a water glass. After 20 years of faithful service, to be treated like I didn't understand basic courtesy or professional standards, it was the moment I realized that no job, no matter how well it pays, is worth sacrificing your fundamental dignity as a human being." Sarah Chen's next question surprised her. "What would you say to employers who might be watching this interview?" Lila looked directly into the camera, thinking about all the households where domestic workers were struggling with similar challenges. "I would say that the people who work in your homes are not fixtures or equipment," she said, her voice gaining strength. "They're professionals with skills, experience, and feelings. They deserve the same basic respect you would show any other service provider. They deserve recognition for their contributions, fair compensation for their work, and the dignity that should come with any honest employment." She paused, then continued, "And I would say that good domestic workers are hard to find because too many employers don't know how to treat them well. If you have someone in your home who takes pride in their work, who anticipates your needs, who makes your life easier, treasure that person. Show them respect, acknowledge their contributions, and remember that they have families and dreams that matter just as much as yours do." The interview continued for several more minutes, with Lila explaining the Foundation's mission and the support services they would provide. She spoke about the legal assistance available for workers facing exploitation, the educational opportunities for professional development, and the advocacy work they would do to strengthen labor protections. "What would you say to domestic workers who might be watching and facing similar situations?" Sarah asked as the interview neared its end. "I would say that your dignity is not negotiable," Lila replied without hesitation. "Your work has value, your contributions matter, and you deserve to be treated with respect. If you're not receiving that respect, you're not alone, and there are people who want to help you change your situation." As the interview concluded, Lila felt a mixture of relief and empowerment. She had spoken clearly about difficult experiences, without anger or bitterness, had presented domestic work as skilled labor deserving of respect, and had offered hope to others who might be struggling in silence. Within an hour of the interview's conclusion, the Foundation's phone lines were overwhelmed with calls, workers sharing their own stories, employers asking for guidance on best practices, community leaders offering support for the Foundation's mission. The response was immediate and substantial, confirming Judge Harrison's prediction that Lila's story would resonate throughout the region. But the most meaningful call came from Mrs. Henderson, the cook who had left the Prescotts years earlier. "I saw you on television," she said, when Lila answered the phone. "I wanted you to know how proud I am of you for speaking up. You said things I've wanted to say for years, and you said them with such grace and dignity. Your mother would be so proud." As Lila hung up the phone, she realized that the terrifying interview had become something transformative. She had found her public voice had articulated experiences that many workers shared, but few had the platform to express, and had begun the process of changing how society understood and valued domestic work. The local news interview was just the beginning. Already, requests were coming in for her to speak at conferences, to meet with legislators about worker protection laws, to consult with other organizations developing similar support programs. Lila Washington, who had spent 20 years trying to remain invisible, was about to become the most visible advocate for domestic workers' rights in the state. And for the first time since that night with the water glass, she felt ready for whatever came next. The morning after Lila's television interview, the Foundation office buzzed with an energy that none of them had anticipated. The live television camera that had seemed so intimidating the day before had transformed private suffering into public awareness, and the response was overwhelming in both its scope and its intensity. By 10 o'clock, they had received over 200 phone calls. Workers from across the region shared stories that echoed Lila's experience. Years of accumulated disrespect, wages withheld for imaginary infractions, credit taken for their innovations, and the daily struggle to maintain dignity while being treated as invisible. Maria Santos, a housekeeper from Mount Pleasant, called to report that her employer regularly deducted money from her wages for broken items that showed normal wear and tear. "I saw you on TV," she told Lila through tears. "I thought I was the only one going through this. I thought maybe I was doing something wrong." James Wright, who managed a large estate in Kiowa, described how his employer's wife criticized his landscaping work in front of neighbors, then took credit for his garden designs at social events. 23 years I've been making their property beautiful," he said. "Yesterday, my boss's wife told the garden club that she has a natural gift for landscape design. I wanted to quit on the spot, but I need this job." Each call reinforced what Lila had learned from her own experience, that workplace dignity wasn't a luxury but a fundamental right that too many domestic workers were being denied. The Foundation's 3 volunteer coordinators worked frantically to document each case, schedule follow-up appointments, and connect callers with appropriate resources. Judge Harrison arrived at noon with 2 additional attorneys, and by afternoon they had identified at least 15 cases that required immediate legal intervention. But not all the responses were supportive. Eleanor's public relations campaign was also bearing fruit, generating pushback from some quarters of Charleston's social establishment. The first sign of organized opposition came in the form of a letter to the editor published in the morning newspaper, signed by concerned citizens of Charleston. The letter suggested that Lila's interview represented an attack on the employment relationships that have sustained our community for generations, and warned that outside agitators were trying to destroy the mutual respect and trust that characterizes domestic employment in the South. The language was coded but clear. This was pushback from employers who felt threatened by workers speaking publicly about their experiences. More direct opposition came through social media, where several prominent Charleston socialites shared posts questioning Lila's credibility and suggesting that disgruntled employees were being encouraged to make false claims against respected families for financial gain. Eleanor herself had remained silent publicly, but her influence was evident in the coordinated nature of the criticism. She was clearly working behind the scenes to frame Lila's advocacy as opportunistic rather than authentic. Marcus arrived at the Foundation office that afternoon to find his mother fielding hostile calls alongside the supportive ones. He listened as Lila patiently explained to an angry caller that the Foundation wasn't encouraging frivolous complaints, but rather providing support for workers facing genuine exploitation. "Mom, you don't have to justify yourself to people who are determined to misunderstand your message," he said, after she hung up from a particularly difficult conversation. "Yes, I do," Lila replied quietly. "Every worker who calls here looking for help deserves to know that we'll stand behind them even when it's uncomfortable. If I back down from criticism now, what message does that send to someone who's afraid to speak up about their own situation?" The afternoon brought a surprise visitor that changed the tenor of the entire day. Mrs. Blackwood, the old Charleston money socialite who had witnessed Eleanor's tirade at the dinner party, appeared at the Foundation office carrying a substantial check and a prepared statement. "I've been thinking about what I witnessed that night," she told Lila directly. "I've also been thinking about how I've treated the people who work in my own home over the years. Your interview made me realize that silence in the face of injustice makes me complicit in that injustice." Mrs. Blackwood's donation was significant, but her public statement was even more valuable. As one of Charleston's most respected social leaders, her endorsement of the Foundation carried weight with exactly the demographic that Eleanor was trying to turn against Lila. Mrs. Washington demonstrated more grace under pressure that evening than many of us would have managed. Mrs. Blackwood's statement read, "Her advocacy for worker dignity reflects the values of respect and fairness that should characterize all employment relationships." The statement was picked up by local media and shared widely on social platforms, providing a counter-narrative to Eleanor's whisper campaign. By evening, the foundation had received commitments from 12 additional attorneys to provide pro bono services, donations totaling over $50,000, and volunteer offers from nearly 100 community members who wanted to support the foundation's mission. Most importantly, they had documented over 300 cases of workers seeking assistance, representing issues ranging from wage theft to unsafe working conditions to the kind of systematic disrespect that Lila had endured for 20 years. "This is bigger than any of us imagined," Judge Harrison told Lila as they reviewed the day's responses. "You've given voice to something that was happening in silence throughout this community. That takes tremendous courage." Lila looked around. The office had volunteers answering phones, attorneys reviewing cases, and Marcus organizing follow-up appointments for workers who needed immediate assistance. The television interview had been terrifying, but it had also been transformative, not just for her, but for an entire community of workers who had been waiting for someone to speak first. The fight was just beginning, but for the first time, it felt like a fight they could win. Eleanor Prescott's resignation letter arrived at the foundation office on Friday morning, hand-delivered by a courier service and marked urgent, personal, and confidential. The brief, bitter document represented her final attempt to control the narrative and her ultimate recognition that she had lost the battle for public opinion. The letter was professionally typed, but the anger bled through every carefully chosen word. "I resign from any association with the so-called Lila Washington Foundation, an organization that appears designed to enrich its founders through false claims against respected Charleston families. I reject any suggestion that my household management practices were inappropriate, and I reserve all legal rights regarding the defamatory statements made about my character and conduct." But Eleanor's resignation came too late to stop the momentum that Lila's interview had generated. That same morning, the Charleston Post and Courier published a front-page investigation into domestic worker conditions throughout the region, featuring interviews with dozens of workers who had come forward after seeing Lila on television. The newspaper's investigation revealed a pattern of exploitation that extended far beyond the Prescott household. Workers described wages withheld for arbitrary reasons, unsafe working conditions ignored by employers, and a culture of disrespect that treated domestic employees as property rather than professionals. More damaging to Eleanor personally, the investigation included financial records that Richard had provided showing the systematic theft from both household accounts and charitable funds. The numbers were stark and undeniable. $200,000 diverted from its intended purposes, while Eleanor simultaneously criticized the work of the woman whose wages she was stealing. Eleanor's response was to schedule her own press conference, held at the elegant downtown law office of her divorce attorney. She appeared before a small group of reporters wearing a perfectly tailored black suit, and the kind of composed expression she had perfected for 20 years of social events. "I am the victim of a coordinated attack by disgruntled former employees. And my soon-to-be ex-husband," she began, reading from prepared remarks. "The allegations against me are fabricated, designed to extract money from my family and damage my reputation in this community where I have contributed generously to charitable causes for decades." The performance was polished, but unconvincing. When reporters asked specific questions about the financial irregularities, Eleanor deflected with vague references to accounting discrepancies and misunderstandings about budget allocations. When asked about the testimony of multiple workers describing similar treatment, she dismissed their accounts as coordinated lies encouraged by opportunistic lawyers. Most damaging to her credibility was her response when asked directly about the dinner party incident that had triggered Lila's departure. Mrs. Washington was corrected for inappropriate behavior during a formal dinner, Eleanor said, with obvious disdain. Any employee who cannot accept professional feedback without creating drama is unsuitable for household management positions. The words revealed exactly the attitude that had made Lila's working life unbearable, the characterization of basic human dignity as drama, and the framing of humiliation as professional feedback. The press conference backfired spectacularly. Instead of generating sympathy for Eleanor's position, it confirmed every criticism that had been made about her character and conduct. Social media responses were swift and harsh, with commenters noting Eleanor's complete lack of remorse or self-reflection. More significantly, Eleanor's public comments prompted additional workers to come forward with their own stories of mistreatment. By the end of the day, the foundation had received 43 new calls from people who had worked for Eleanor's friends and social circle, describing a culture of disrespect that extended throughout Charleston's elite households. Richard, watching Eleanor's press conference from the foundation office, looked both sad and relieved. "I married that woman 25 years ago," he told Lila quietly. "I thought I knew who she was. I'm sorry it took me so long to see what you were dealing with." Every day, the legal consequences of Eleanor's actions were becoming clear as well. The district attorney's office announced that they were opening a formal investigation into the charitable fund diversions, and the IRS was reviewing the tax implications of the misappropriated money. Eleanor's attempt to frame herself as a victim had instead drawn official attention to potential criminal violations. Judge Harrison arrived at the foundation office that evening with news that would define the final chapter of the confrontation. "The state legislature has fast-tracked a domestic workers' bill of rights," he announced. "Your interview and the subsequent attention to these issues has prompted them to move on legislation that's been stalled for 3 years. The proposed legislation would require written contracts for domestic workers, mandate overtime pay protections, establish clear procedures for resolving workplace disputes, and create penalties for employers who retaliated against workers seeking legal assistance." Eleanor's press conference may have been the best thing that could have happened for this legislation, Judge Harrison continued. Her complete lack of empathy or understanding made the case for worker protections better than any advocacy speech could have. Lila felt a profound sense of completion as she read through the proposed legislation. Her 20 years of enduring disrespect in silence had culminated in systemic changes that would protect countless other workers from similar experiences. Eleanor's final attempt to destroy Lila's credibility had instead sealed her own downfall, while strengthening the movement for worker dignity that Lila had inadvertently started with 4 whispered words. "I can't live like this." The battle was over, but the real work of building lasting change was just beginning. 6 months later, Lila Washington stood at the podium of the South Carolina State House, holding a check made out to Marcus Washington, the first scholarship, awarded by the foundation that bore her name. The check represented more than financial assistance. It symbolized the full circle of justice and the investment in a next generation that would never have to choose between dignity and opportunity the way she had for 20 years. The legislation signing ceremony had drawn domestic workers from across the state, along with advocates, legislators, and employers who supported the new protections. Governor Martinez spoke about the importance of ensuring that all workers could pursue their livelihoods with dignity and respect, while Judge Harrison explained how the new law would provide concrete remedies for exploitation and abuse. But it was Lila's speech that brought many in the audience to tears. 6 months ago, I was a woman who cleaned houses and tried to remain invisible, she began, her voice steady and confident in a way that would have been unimaginable during her years of silent endurance. Today, I stand before you as the director of an organization that has helped over 800 domestic workers assert their rights, find better employment, and pursue educational opportunities. She looked out at the audience, seeing faces of workers who had found the courage to speak up about their own situations, employers who had committed to treating their staff with greater respect, and young people who were learning that domestic Work deserved the same dignity as any other profession. But the most important change hasn't been in legislation or legal protections, Lila continued. It's been in the understanding that every person who works in our homes, who cares for our families, who makes our daily lives possible, deserves to be seen as a full human being with dignity, dreams, and contributions that matter. Marcus sat in the front row, wearing the white coat of his pediatric residency at Charleston Children's Hospital. His graduation from medical school 3 months earlier had been a celebration not just of his achievement, but of his mother's 20 years of sacrifice finally bearing fruit. Now, watching her speak with authority and grace to state legislators and community leaders, he saw the completion of a transformation that had begun with 4 whispered words at a dinner party. Richard Prescott was also in the audience, sitting toward the back with an expression of quiet pride. His divorce from Eleanor had been finalized the previous month, with Eleanor agreeing to a settlement that included substantial restitution to the foundation and a signed acknowledgement of the financial irregularities that had funded her lifestyle. She had relocated to Atlanta, far from the Charleston community, where her reputation had been irreparably damaged. Richard had not sought public credit for his role in supporting the foundation, preferring to work behind the scenes to provide funding and business expertise. His relationship with Lila had evolved into a genuine friendship based on mutual respect, something that had been impossible when their interactions were defined by employer and employee roles. The foundation's impact had exceeded everyone's expectations. In addition to providing direct assistance to workers facing exploitation, they had facilitated the formation of a domestic workers' union, established partnerships with community colleges for career development programs, and created a certification system that helped workers demonstrate their professional qualifications to potential employers. More significantly, they had begun to change the conversation about domestic work itself. Media coverage consistently framed their advocacy in terms of professional development and worker dignity rather than labor disputes or class conflict. Employers were increasingly reaching out for guidance on best practices, seeking to ensure that their households operated with fairness and respect. After the ceremony, Lila drove to Magnolia Cemetery, where her mother had been buried 15 years earlier. She had visited the grave regularly throughout her years with the Prescotts, but today felt different, like a homecoming after a long journey rather than a routine remembrance. "Mama," she said quietly, placing fresh flowers on the simple headstone, "I kept my promise. I kept my head high, no matter what. But I learned something else too. Sometimes keeping your head high means refusing to accept what other people think you should tolerate." She told her mother about the foundation, about the legislation, about Marcus's success, and the hundreds of workers who had found their voices through the organization that bore her name. She talked about dignity being something you claimed rather than something others granted, and about the difference between enduring injustice and transforming it. A chance encounter interrupted her reflection. Eleanor appeared at the cemetery's entrance, walking slowly toward a different section, where Charleston's older families maintained elaborate mausoleums. She saw Lila and hesitated, clearly debating whether to acknowledge her or simply pass by. Finally, Eleanor approached, her expression unreadable. "I saw the news coverage of the bill signing," she said quietly. "Congratulations on your success." The words were formal, careful, but they carried something that might have been grudging acknowledgement of Lila's dignity. "Thank you," Lila replied graciously. "I hope you're finding peace in Atlanta." Eleanor nodded, then surprised Lila with her next words. "You were always professional, even when I made it difficult. I should have recognized that before it was too late." It wasn't an apology exactly, but it was perhaps as close to one as Eleanor was capable of offering. Lila accepted it with the same grace she had maintained throughout 20 years of much harsher words. As Eleanor walked away toward her family's elaborate monuments, Lila reflected on the strange symmetry of the encounter. They had both been changed by the events that began with a water glass and 4 whispered words, though in very different ways. The sun was setting as Lila drove home to her new apartment, larger than her old one, furnished with pieces she had chosen for herself rather than inherited from others. Marcus would be joining her for dinner, bringing news from his residency and plans for his own future advocacy work with underserved communities. The domestic workers' movement would continue growing, with new challenges and new opportunities ahead. But tonight, Lila Washington would simply enjoy the quiet satisfaction of a promise kept, a battle won, and a future that stretched ahead, with dignity intact and possibilities unlimited. Some changes, she had learned, began with the smallest acts of courage. Sometimes the biggest revolutions started with someone finally saying, "I can't live like this," and meaning it enough to do something about it.